Quick disclaimer, though I'm associated with the upcoming unofficial Romhack Awards, and I'll be sharing both positive and negative opinions on certain nominees, I intentionally waited until after the voting had ended to release this video because I didn't want to unintentionally have a major influence on how the votes played out. This is all just my personal opinion and analysis. If you don't agree, that's fine, and I'd love to hear your thoughts. Alright, on to the video. Before getting into today's topic, I want to discuss the most villainous thing imaginable. Sacred Stones rebalances. For those not in the know, rebalances of Fire Emblem Sacred Stones, or FE8 for short, have become kinda infamous in the ROM hacking scene for a variety of reasons. The main one being that they are very common, and it's not hard to see why. FE8 is the easiest game in the series to ROM hack because of all the tools that support it, and because of how few hard-coded things need to be changed. And it's easier to edit existing content a little bit than to draft up and create additional work. And that's not to say that rebalances don't have a place or that they shouldn't be made, because you should make whatever you want. If you want to make, like, Sacred Stones but you doubled all the growth rates, go for it. I don't understand why you would make that, and I probably wouldn't play it, but you don't need to give a rat's ass about what I think. It's your game. However, with all that being said, the other thing rebalances struggle with is, frankly, giving people a reason to play it. And again, not that you need to care about that, but most people do to some extent. If you're the type of person who plays FE Romhacks, you've probably played Sacred Stones before, most likely multiple times. And within that context, if you have the option between Sacred Stones but it's slightly different and a full brand new experience, a lot of people would choose the latter, especially since new, exciting stuff is coming out all the time. In just the past few months, we've gotten a bunch of highly anticipated projects finally being completed, including, but not limited to, Dream of Five by Parrhesia and Lumi, The Morrow's Golden Country by Retina, and Cerulean Crescent by Rivian. I've used 2 separate videos to bring up his one-chapter hack closing act, just glazing it up, and I'll do it a third time if you give me a chance. Don't test me. So the question that evolves is, why make a rebalance instead of making new maps, characters, and story? And from there, why work with the existing material at all? Why set your creation in an existing work's frame when you could cast those chains aside and chart your own territory? Of course, if we were to take it to the logical extreme, we could ask ourselves from there, why make a ROM hack derivative of an existing work at all when you could make your own game? And obviously, there's a lot of answers to that, like time, money, resources, just how fun it is to make, and much more. That's clearly a question we have an answer to, and isn't worth analyzing. But I think those first few questions are worth analyzing, because I do believe that there are artistic or creative reasons why you'd want to set your story in an existing setting, or build your game as a ROM hack instead of its own standalone product. I bring this up in the first place because I want to talk about 2 amazing hacks that both take the vanilla FE8 characters and setting, but use them to try something different. These are Dark Stone by Saint Rubenio and Curse of Lagdou by Doin' Things. I will be talking about them both mostly in writing and story context, but I'll also point out the ways that the general goal for the games are visible in both story and gameplay. I'll try to minimize spoilers, but I reserve the right to discuss the first act or so freely. Let's start with Dark Stone, a ROM hack of FE8 where you play as the villains. Whoa! Whoa! The cursor is purple! Oh, I'm so easily entertained. Important to note, this is not quite a rebalance. A bunch of the vanilla content and story has been retooled and put into a completely different perspective and context. It is literally Sacred Stones but flipped completely on its head, and the gameplay reflects this. The vast majority of the maps are the same, but with some things changed, like different enemy placements, different bosses, different starting position, things like that. And in the same way, the essential characters to the plot are the same. It's just that we're looking at it from a different angle this time around. Since the villains are the focus, the main character is Leon, and the playable cast mostly consists of bosses from the base game. The major characters you'll see in cutscenes most often are the main generals of Grotto, being Volter, Kalec, Reeve, Glenn, Selena, and Dusel. These characters are very well characterized in the original game, and this hack not only expands upon that existing character work, but also takes a little bit of creative freedom to expand these characters in new directions. Like, what kind of friendship might the generals find with each other? What depths might they sink to? I found myself pleasantly surprised by it. It experiments with the characters without ever breaking character, if that makes sense. Kalec is one of my favorite characters in all of Fire Emblem, and Rubenio's writing for him is absolutely perfect. Nothing that I would change at all. He's an ambitious scumbag with a sense of humor, and that's exactly what he's meant to be. The roster is also padded out by various chapter boss characters that you've probably forgotten about, like Zonta, Murray, and Bayran. These are characters that have basically zero personality or backstory in the main game, so Rubenio had to pretty much create new personalities for them. And hey, you know what? It works out well. There's one character that hits a weird middle ground between these two things, however, and that is Hayden. Hayden is simultaneously an established character in Sacred Stones and is also really, really boring and just has nothing interesting going on. So in Darkstone, Rubenio said, fuck it, we're gonna do something really, really weird. He betrays his country to serve the Demon King, he hates his children, he hates being a king, he's an awful, disgusting man. Normally, this is the type of thing I'd be very against, but because Hayden has so little character in the original game, I think this actually works very well as a definitively alternative interpretation of the character, as opposed to an expansion of the canon. If this were a character that has a lot of material to establish who they are, someone like Joshua, Garcia, or Cormag, then yeah, that would cause problems, but like Hayden just has nothing in Sacred Stone. Like, who gives a shit about a little bit of character assassination from him? Like, does he have fans? I don't think so. And I do like the way St. Rubenio writes him too, if only because he has a lot of really awesome boss dialogues with his former allies that are just really impactful and punch you in the gut. And honestly, for that alone, this is worth it. There's also a route split like the base game has, but instead of picking one side and only playing that one, your army splits into two halves, and you jump back and forth between the two, which is an established thing that some fan games and rebalances do. Most famously, the Four Kings does this. In order to make sure your army has enough recruits for both sides, there are some new original characters made by St. Rubenio. The important thing to note, however, is that all of these OCs have some kind of basis in the original game's lore or unused content. For example, McGregor is based on a character that was mentioned multiple times in Sacred Stones, both as Leon's teacher and as a priest that worked with Natasha. And Tiffany is the little girl that Leon managed to save using the magic of the Dark Stone. So these characters aren't just pulled from thin air. They're based on existing elements of Magvel. This is crucial for something I'll be talking about later. I'm going to move on from this for now and come back to it. Just know that these OCs are primarily to add to the stories of the existing characters, to add more characterization to Leon, Dusel, Selena, etc., as opposed to being the center of attention themselves. I mean, ignore the fact that Tiffany is, in Rubenio's own words, the fan favorite and it's not even close. But like, that's the fans' fault, not the game. Now on the flip side, Curse of Lagdou, by doing things, does pretty much the exact opposite. Instead of focusing on the existing characters, it focuses primarily on the original ones made by him. And before you go, ha! Cringe! Let me elaborate on this and tell you why it's actually the coolest thing ever. One might wonder, if you're going to focus on original characters, why put it in an existing setting at all? Why not make a new world with new countries and lore? And a lot of the times I'd agree, but Curse of Lagdou uses the already established lore of Magvel as a jumping off point for everything else. Because, as I mentioned, anybody playing a Romhack has probably played Sacred Stones. And this game knows that its player base is familiar with all the world building that game did. So it doesn't have to spend a bunch of time on the opening map crawl explaining the Continent of Magvel. 800 years ago, something or other happened and the Sacred Stone, whatever. The opening chapters are used to expand upon the world building that already exists for places like Carcino and the Lagdou ruins. We don't have to spend time framing the conflict we already know, and we can just use that as a reference point for these new characters and their situation. And the new characters are informed by that world building too. Like Bo here, who is a grotto soldier, a conscripted one no less, assigned to search through the Lagdou ruins and had a really fucked up experience with the cursed sword there. So Bo's story of how he got here expands the lore of the Lagdou ruins, which then gets tied into the main conflict later on. And we don't have to spend a bunch of time establishing who this Reeve guy is and why he's important, because Vanilla Sacred Stones already did that. So while yes, Ephraim and Erica are there, this isn't really Ephraim and Erica's story. If we look at, say, Kingdom Hearts, just because we spend time with Simba and Aladdin and Mickey Mouse doesn't mean this isn't Sora's story. In the same vein, Curse of Lagdou is about Isabelle and Jean before it's about Joshua or Ross. The gameplay philosophy also kind of reflects this, honestly, as we have a slew of new maps and a bunch of new gameplay mechanics, most notably the crit system. If your crit is below 50, you just can't crit at all, and if it's above 50, the first attack will crit guaranteed. And 50 crit might sound like it's hard to get to, but various characters and weapons have different ways to boost their crit chance in order to get up there. This is on top of doing funky stuff with weapon ranges and making more significant changes to the weapon types. However, a bunch of units from the vanilla game still return, and they still fill that same general niche as they did before. People like Ross, Joshua, and Colm, who are now acting as sort of the filler units who just sort of exist to round out the cast and make the conflict feel a bit vaster, as opposed to being the primary focus. The turns have indeed tabled here. Now, this isn't something I'd recommend everybody do, of course not. It is important to see new settings that will work better with different kinds of stories. And full disclosure, I haven't finished Curse of Lagdou yet. I'm working on it, alright? But I don't see this sort of technique used very often, and I recommend everyone at least try the early game of Curse of Lagdou, if only to see how well this is done. And also, you should play Curse of Lagdou because it's just a fun game. Now, just because Curse of Lagdou works in Magvel doesn't mean it couldn't be even better in an original setting. Magvel characters who are important to the plot can be replaced with new characters that have the same general personality and goals. Those who aren't can be replaced by unimportant jobbers that have little personality and like 2 lines of dialogue, so we just don't even have to focus on them. But consider that doesn't feel good to have jobbers that have 2 lines of dialogue and like aren't important blatantly. To have a dude just come in, go, "I am Weber," and then never speak again. And if we want to give them a bunch of conditionals, new supports, extra dialogue to flesh out that character, that adds a whole new degree of workload. And I've spoken to Doing Things before, and it doesn't seem like he wants to bear that extra burden for a character that's only here to fill out the roster with warm bodies in a game with permadeath. And honestly, like, yeah, I get it. Of course, someone will fall in love with the unimportant jobbers anyways, because even Ralph from Thracia, the character so bland I forgot to recruit him, has fans. But I don't know, I'm more okay with seeing a lot of familiar faces who end up not mattering much than seeing a bunch of OCs that got the short end of the favoritism stick, you know? This whole segment is probably the most contentious part of the video. I'm still kind of sorting out my thoughts on this specific matter, so I'd love to hear more of people's opinions on this. Feel free to share any points you have in the comments. Magvel also doesn't have super heavy world building, so it doesn't have ridiculous amount of limitations either. This isn't a setting designed for a specific type of story, like Jugdrall or Fodland, or I'd argue even Tellius. Like, Magvel doesn't really get in the way of the content, at least not in a way that I've noticed, because it's still not afraid to add new elements to the plot, change the pacing and order of certain story beats, add new characters and new locations, while also respecting the original lore. We're adding new things tastefully to, like, make it work better, you know? And there's a difference. Dear God, is there a difference? Now, I'm going to talk about a different hack that I think is an example of what not to do. And before I go into this, I want to reiterate, this is not to spread hate on the hack or to point and laugh and go, ha ha, you know? Hacks are made for fun and provided for free by people who are just making something because they're passionate about the series. I'm not saying you should have done better or you shouldn't have wasted my time on blah blah blah. No, I'm obviously not doing that. I want to take a productive but critical look at something that I personally don't think works very well. I don't want to make this like an attack or a call for people to brigade the project thread. Please don't do that. Just, not only do I think there's room for improvement, but I want it to improve. I want the next thing that everyone makes to be awesome, and that's why I'm critiquing this here. Are we on the same page? Good. So, Project Jade. This is an FE8 rebalance. No, don't go running and screaming yet. Let me finish, hear me out. It is actually a pretty hefty overhaul of FE8, and one of the features is that, similar to Darkstone, you play both routes of the route split before they reconvene. And there are some new units, and thus new original characters, to help fill out the cast to make that work. Which is a good thing for the added route split, to be clear. That is probably necessary to make that work. However, I don't like the way Project Jade handles it for a few reasons. We aren't focusing heavily on these new characters like in Curse of Lagdou. It's still very much the story of Sacred Stones. This is about Ephraim and Erica before anybody else. Obviously, that's not a bad thing by any means. I really like the story of Sacred Stones. And we aren't trying to make Eddie the main character. We could if we wanted to. We could make Eddie the protagonist and give him the flaws and character conflict needed to make that engaging, but that just isn't the goal in the first place. However, also, unlike Darkstone, these characters have no grounding in previously established world lore. Their stories are very disconnected from the conflict. They feel very out of place. Like they only exist to fill out the rosters, and they only have personalities and backstories because it was something that had to be filled out in a checklist. Play Darkstone and see how characters like Tiffany and McGregor add layers to Leon as a character and make him so much more complex and three-dimensional. Leon talking to Tiffany about the horrors of war shows some of his softer and more human side. How much he really does care about the people around him. Whereas the length he's willing to go to in order to manipulate McGregor into helping him shows just how much he's still willing to hurt people with no Demon King influence in order to achieve his goals. Curse of Lagdou has Franny. She has a lot of history with some characters that in the original game are just throwaway chapter bosses. It adds a whole new level of depth to all of them, the way they stand against each other, but still care about each other too. It's a quick and easy way to give all of them a lot of layers. Meanwhile, Project Jade frankly just doesn't achieve the same thing. Like, Eddie comes in like, I am Ederic the Brave, I'm here to help, and Ephraim's like, yes, we will accept your help. And then the same thing happens with Ahab and Andrew and Dima and Harvey and how many others, and I don't know, man, it just doesn't feel like these characters are adding anything meaningful to the story being told. Like, they're just grunts that are here because the route split needs more bodies, and granted, that can be fine, but if that's the case, why bother giving them dialogue or supports at all? At that point, you might as well lean into the idea of them being nameless grunts that are expendable. And look, I want to say, I see the vision, right? Because Sacred Stones is a shorter game, with the story more focused on characters than world building, while already having one of the smallest casts in the whole series, the world can feel pretty small at times. So having a bigger cast from more varied walks of life can make Magvel feel more lived in. Like, the world is a dynamic place with all sorts of people, not just knights and royalty. However, these characters are one-dimensional and boring, and this is coming from the person who likes the cast of Fates and Engage. These people just need to be more interesting. They need more layers. Probably the worst example is this thief you recruit in Fort Ridgewald of Ephraim route. Since Tana is going on Erica's route in this hack, this is the character that gets captured in her place, and he's a thief, which Ephraim needs. So that much, good call. I agree with that decision. Now, this character is a gay man. That's pretty cool, but every single line he has in Chapter 9 is somehow related to him being attracted to men. Frankly, this is like the stereotype of a badly written gay character. I'm not asking you to make a whole-ass Dragon Age companion here, but this cannot be the only character trait he has. Characters in Vanilla Fire Emblem are often one note, but even then, they have some dimensions to the one note. The supports will push them even just a little bit, explore that one note, see how it clashes with other people's one note. And that's what often makes supports interesting and fun to read. However, I will say, I went through some of his supports in FE Builder, and some of it actually goes kinda hard. Like, there's one where he talks about how he used to be an assassin, and how hard it is to forgive himself for that. And honestly, it's not a bad support, and most of his other supports are him making innuendos and flirting, which gets really obnoxious. And the two things just don't mesh together tonally, in my opinion. Like, you can have serious characters with silly moments, and vice versa, but the two need to feel like they can go together, like they could exist in the same space without it contradicting. And there's never a point where these two parts of Kieran intersect within the same conversation. These two conversations feel like two different characters that are talking. These two parts of his personality don't inform each other. So let's say, hypothetically, right? If we were to just start over with this guy and just start with gay thief, where should you go? Well, you should think about what questions you should ask yourself about this character and find the answers to those questions. Think about, what is the state of Grotto that has forced him to become a thief? Did he have any friends? What happened to them? Does he have any hobbies? Any dreams? Any fears? Does he have a favorite weather? Has he ever been to a nation other than Grotto? If he hasn't, then why? And if you want to further incorporate his sexuality, how does he feel about it? I mean, he clearly feels a certain pride about it, but did it take time to get to that point? And how did it happen? How does the world around him feel about it? Is there perhaps another character in the cast who's closeted and coming to terms with it? Maybe he can have a support chain with them in order to address some of the complexities that come with sexuality and gender identity. And just one of them does not make a full character, a three-dimensional human being, but together they do. And in turn, if they are informed by the world around them is informed by them existing in it. And that's what makes Darkstone and Curse of Lagdou so good. Isabelle is informed by being a high-class Carcino merchant, and that shapes her opinions about other things. Jeanne is informed by being a lower-class trans woman in a situation where she and her friends are forced to fend for themselves, and that shapes her opinions about other things. Tiffany is a little girl whose life was miraculously saved, given another chance, and is still learning that in the same way that the world can be kind, the world can be cruel in equal measure. McGregor is a broken man who is trying his best to hold on to a thread of hope that his path forward is the right one by putting trust in Leon, without the knowledge that Leon not only can and will shatter that trust if necessary, but he already has. Project Jade needs these dynamic, complicated viewpoints in greater quantities. And generally, I think the same issue extends into Project Jade's gameplay. Obviously, I don't think it's like complete trash, because Sacred Stones is one of my favorites in the series, but there are some choices in there that I find odd. Every single character now has a personal skill, and sometimes that skill feels very well thought out. Like Garcia having Spur Strength to help make Ross easier to train, or Gilliam having skills that protect his nearby allies, or Seth having Mercy so he can choose to leave people at 1 HP, making it easier to train weaker units, stuff like that. But other times, it feels so weird. Like this new guy, Ahab, has Axe Faith, so he never loses durability with axes. And he starts with the killer axe in his inventory, but then you also get his friend Marty in the same chapter, who has worse stats in every way, worse skills, hell, even his growths are bad. What is the point of Marty? Why does he exist? Why would I ever use him when Ahab is here? Or like any other axe user? And lastly, my final note, my final ham-on if you will, for if you want to put your game in an existing setting, you need to understand the characters that are already there. Darkstone understands that though Leon may be a tragic villain, he is still, at the end of the day, a villain. He's willing to hurt good people, even his closest friends, in order to make his goals come true. Reeve may be a disgusting man, but he was driven to be this way by his banishment from Roston for what seemed like an innocent suggestion to him. Glenn is an ultimately righteous man that can't help but continue fighting for the only cause he's ever known, unjust though it may be. Curse of Lagdou has less new dialogue for the existing characters since, as discussed, it puts more focus on the OCs, but it understands who everyone is and what role they fill. My favorite example is Kyle, who keeps everybody on track. Like, no matter how we get distracted, he's like, hey, remember that thing we have to do? Part of why I bring this up is because there's one scene added in Project Jade that confuses me so much. When the route split occurs, Ross goes to one side and Garcia goes to the other, so they have a scene to address this, which is a good idea to have that. But in this scene, as one of the first lines, Garcia says, and I quote, "I'm sure the princess doesn't need a kid like you getting in her way." And that made me say, hold the phone, Project Jade. You stop right there in your tracks. Garcia isn't perfect. He famously has that scene in Vanilla FE8 in Chapter 2 where his overprotectiveness of his son means he fails to consider what Ross actually wants. But Garcia respects Ross, not just for the potential he has to become a great warrior and a great man, but the strength that he's already gained through his hard work and his training. Garcia is proud of what his son has already done and what he will continue to do. And I know this new scene has a heartwarming ending where they hug it out, but Garcia would never, ever talk to his son like that in the first place. I know this is just one line, but it struck me so hard. It's just weird that I found myself like looking out for more stuff like this in the future, which I don't normally do. I don't normally do that with things that have existing characters in it, but it was just like, this was just so odd to me. You really can't have instances that are this far out of character. And of course, this is a standout example that is particularly bad. It's obviously not this bad for the entire game. It goes, up and down. I'm not going to go through every single instance of like, it's in character for Lute to be oblivious to people's emotions, or like it's out of character for Amelia to tease someone like she does with Andrew, or whatever. This is just the example I noticed of something that you have to be cautious for. That when you go back and you look at these scenes that you've written, you have to think, would this character actually say that? So, to bring it all back around, what point am I making? Well, while most people will opt to make Romhack stories, or just stories in general, in their own original setting with their own original cast, and to be clear, that is probably the best choice for many stories, I do think there are potential benefits for going with pre-established lore and characters, and making your own spin on it. Whether or not you want to call it fan fiction, or if it's a fan game, or if it's a short film or an animation, whatever, you know what I mean. Just because a character's story is already told doesn't mean that there isn't room for further exploration of that character, or that the same groundwork for that story can't be used for new characters and their stories. However, you really need to understand the characters in the world before you do that. Study them very closely so then you can stay true to that original world building. And to be clear, changing things is allowed, but you need to know why you change something. What exactly this is fixing or adding to the story. Like in Radiant Dawn, people always discussed, okay, the Blood Pact causes a lot of issues narratively and with character agency. How do we fix that? But we've never had like a Radiant Dawn thing where it's like, okay, we need Ike to just go up to Soren and say something awful and like devastating to him. These aren't what we're talking about with Radiant Dawn. These are not the problems that need fixing. If you aren't careful about that, it can really hurt how believable your interpretation of that world is, and therefore hurt the rest of your story. But despite that, I really think that a character's story never really ends with the product that gets published. People talk about those characters, they discuss what those characters have been through, we discuss other ways it can go, and I think that also has a lot of artistic value. I guess this is just kind of a long-winded way of saying, if you're going to write in a pre-existing setting, do it good, which is like, wow, fucking brilliant analysis, Nikki, great job. But hopefully all of the elaboration I went on there helps you to understand the specifics of it, and if you still don't, then try playing these games, and maybe that'll help you learn too. If the creator of Project Jade is watching, please don't let this discourage you. Please continue working on whatever you're working on, whether that be Project Jade or something else entirely. I hope whatever you make next is super, super awesome. I'm honestly looking forward to it. Now, if you'll excuse me, I've had a video on the back burner to finish since summer of 2023 about how I would change and fix the plot of Fire Emblem Genealogy of the Holy War, so I think I'm gonna go put it off even longer so I can play Baldur's Gate 3 more. Look, the first 360 hours wasn't enough, alright?